Okay, welcome back. We're still talking about gathering business requirements. So is there a particular requirement for some privacy things? Like, are you storing, customer credit card data, for example? That would be something you need to ask them. And then, of course, flexibility. Do you know with some degree of certainty how many customers you're going to have, or you expect that to grow at a steady rate, or, so depending on how good a crystal ball you have, you might get some good data there, and you might get, I don't really know, we're hoping we're going to double by next year, that kind of information. And so that's a good indication of perhaps moving to the cloud. This concept of elastic scalability is a very cool cloud feature in that as my business grow, I can just turn the knob up. I mean, it'll cost me more on a monthly basis, but I don't have to go spend any capital funds to be able to buy another server or those kinds of things. Okay, so those are kind of the business requirements. So let's talk about technical requirements. And then, again, you're not going to ask your accounting folks these questions. So we're talking about what services and applications are going to be installed and where they're going to be installed, like email and calendar and, database, those kinds of things. And it's a rule of thumb in that, like in our scenario where we built an Active Directory domain controller, that you don't put any other services on the domain controller. It's that important that it basically just sits alone and does Active Directory things and nothing else. I mean, you don't put a web server on there or an email server. In fact, practically the only service you would put on there is like DNS, because that's kind of sort of required. Okay, and that's about it. So that kind of capacity planning. For example, can I put my internal email server on my external web server? Well, probably not, because one's going to be internal to your own organization, right? And then the other is going to be having people come from the internet. I don't want to mix those zones. So, you got to ask yourself a lot of questions. Update frequency. How often are you going to be updating these things? Is somebody else in charge of updating? Like you have some sort of a component and, they routinely make changes, and, and you hope that the changes don't break. Security, both physical and, IT security from a, hacking point of view. Again, who's doing this? I mean, from a physical point of view, it's pretty simple. You probably have a door, with a cipher lock, maybe a video camera or something. But for automated security, do you have intrusion detection systems, and are you monitoring that 24/7? You hired a company to do that for you? Those kind of things. Remote access. You probably need a list of those things where you absolutely positively must have remote access, and those things that absolutely positively must not have remote access. Very rarely is there anything in between. These are the ones we absolutely have to have, and here's the ones you absolutely must not have, and normally there's nothing in between. Customer access. How much do they get? Again, we're talking back in the the network design course. This would be the demilitarized zone, the DMZ, and that's the only place that customers would come to. They would never, ever, ever set foot inside your local area land at all. They only get the DMZ. Responsiveness. Do you have a technical standard like, so many milliseconds response time for a query, or, like if it's a database, or something like how many, in operations per second, input output operations, or database transactions per second? Do you have some standards like that? And if so, that's going to change how much capacity you want. And then, of course, capacity. If you have a good enough crystal ball, you might say, well, I think we need this amount. And trust me, no matter what number you pick, it's going to be wrong in 6 months. That's just the way the world works. So picking capacity, man, how about this? We had a server, and we said, okay, well, we need 100 gig. So we put in 100 gig. And then somebody comes back and says, well, maybe we need to put more room. Well, what we basically did, we just left space in the 19-inch rack for another 100, and then another 100, and then another 100. That's just how we did it. So if you want a couple terabytes of data, you don't have to buy it up front, but at least leave room in the rack to be able to put that stuff. So the point of all this was it takes a combination of both business and technical requirements. Okay, so that's the end of this chapter, and we'll see you guys again in the next chapter.